Once upon a time, in a small town surrounded by thick woods and quiet winding roads, there lived a woman named Eleanor. Eleanor grew up in a home with faded wallpapers, echoing with silence and resentment. Her father, once a factory worker with calloused hands and stern eyes, spent most evenings drowning his disappointments in drink. Her mother, a seamstress whose needles moved as quickly as her whispered complaints, was distant and worn. Love was scarce, replaced by duty and expectation. Eleanor, the only child, learned that silence was safer than speaking, and that strength meant not needing comfort. When she became an adult, she carried these invisible lessons like weights, marrying George, a kind but timid baker who loved her fiercely. But deep down, Eleanor couldn't shake the ghost of her childhood, whispering that kindness was weakness and vulnerability was a trap. Eleanor and George had one son, Oliver. He was a bright-eyed boy with George's warm smile and a gentle heart. From the start, Eleanor felt torn between an instinctual love for her son and an inexplicable resentment. To her, Oliver represented a vulnerability she never allowed herself, and that made him a target for her frustration. When Oliver was 5, Eleanor's scoldings were sharp, aimed to teach him what she called strength. If he dropped his spoon at dinner, Eleanor's eyes would narrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Be careful, Oliver. If you can't hold a spoon, how will you handle life?" Her voice was cold and dismissive. George would open his mouth to speak, but a quick glance from Eleanor silenced him. Over time, even the smallest mistakes turned into reasons for punishment. If Oliver ran inside with muddy shoes after playing in the yard, Eleanor would grab his wrist tightly, dragging him back to the door. "Clean it up," she'd snap, standing over him as he scrubbed the floor, tears welling up in his eyes. When Oliver was 7, he brought home a crayon drawing from school. It was a simple picture of a house with a sun peeking from behind the roof and a stick figure family. He proudly presented it to Eleanor, who barely looked at it before dismissing it with a wave of her hand. "Art doesn't put food on the table," she muttered, tossing the drawing onto the kitchen counter, where it lay forgotten. Oliver's smile faded, his little fingers crumpling the paper when he thought no one was watching. As he turned 8, Eleanor's criticisms became even more pointed. One evening, Oliver tried to bake cookies with George, hoping to surprise his mother with something they made together. But when Eleanor came home and smelled the burnt edges, her voice cracked like thunder. "Do you think you'll achieve anything with half effort?" she scolded, ignoring George's stammered explanation. She grabbed the baking tray and dropped it into the sink with a clatter. "Stop wasting time with things you'll never be good at, Oliver," she said before storming out. That night, Oliver lay awake, the words echoing in the stillness like an unwelcome guest. By the time he was 10, Eleanor's words were no longer just criticisms. They were sharp, precise weapons that chipped away at Oliver's self-worth. During one particular day at school, Oliver tripped during a relay race and came home with a bruised knee and scraped palms. He hoped for comfort, but found none. "Don't cry, Oliver. Only the weak cry," Eleanor said, her voice a clipped monotone as she cleaned his wound with stinging antiseptic. He bit his lip to hold back tears, feeling her gaze burn into him like a spotlight. George lingered by the door, shifting from foot to foot, wanting to step in, but knowing Eleanor's patience was as thin as ice. Eleanor's coldness extended beyond words. When Oliver brought home a report card with an A in literature but a C in math, she ignored the good grade. "A C? Do you want to be a failure?" she snapped. She took away his favorite book, one he often read to escape into a world of knights and dragons, saying, "No more stories until you prove you're not wasting your time." Oliver stared at the empty space on his shelf, the weight of her words pressing down like a stone. There were rare moments when Eleanor's harshness was physical, though not overtly violent. If Oliver accidentally bumped into her in the hallway, she'd grip his arm with enough force to leave a faint mark, leaning down to whisper, "Watch where you're going, or learn the hard way." The small, almost invisible bruises weren't what hurt the most. It was the knowledge that his mother saw him as more of an inconvenience than a son. Even holidays were shadowed by Eleanor's temperament. On one Christmas morning, Oliver woke early, eager to unwrap the presents under the tree. But when he reached for a gift and accidentally knocked an ornament to the floor, shattering it, Eleanor's rage was swift. "Careless, just like your grandfather," she hissed, eyes flaring with an anger that felt older than her. George tried to console Oliver, but the room was already cold with silence. Every instance carved lines into Oliver's young heart, leaving him with a question that grew heavier each year. Why was he never enough for her? As Oliver grew older, the tension in the household hardened. Eleanor's punishments became more severe, and her words carried a colder edge. One winter evening, Oliver failed an exam and hesitated to tell his mother. But Eleanor found out. Her voice cut through the air like ice. "You'll never amount to anything, just like your grandfather," she shouted, slamming her fist on the table. The echoes in the house swallowed Oliver's silent tears as George tried to intervene, only to be met with Eleanor's glare. Despite her harshness, there were rare moments when a glimmer of softness emerged. Once, during a thunderstorm, Oliver awoke from a nightmare to find Eleanor sitting at the end of his bed. She didn't say a word, only watched him for a moment before standing up and leaving. It was as if she battled a war within herself, torn between nurturing him and pushing him away. By the time Oliver turned 18, he had learned how to shield himself. He excelled at school, driven by a hunger for validation that his mother never gave. One day, he found an old box in the attic, filled with letters and photographs. One letter, tucked beneath a faded photo of Eleanor as a child, was from her mother. It spoke of her own struggles, apologizing for her coldness, but never knowing how to show love. Understanding dawned on Oliver like a light cracking through the dark. His mother had inherited pain like a legacy, never learning how to break the chain. That night, for the first time, Oliver confronted Eleanor. "I found the letters, Mom," he said, voice shaking but steady. She froze, eyes wide, and for a split second, vulnerability flickered. Tears welled up but didn't fall. "Why do you hate me?" he whispered. Eleanor turned away, unable to face the truth. But in that moment, something shifted. She saw the shadow she had become, the echoes of her parents' voices now echoing through her son. It was a moment both painful and cathartic. Eleanor didn't change overnight, but small steps emerged. One evening, Oliver sat at the dining room table, hunched over a model he was building for a school project. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards and the rustle of papers. Eleanor passed by, her eyes flicking over the small, meticulous pieces scattered across the table. For a moment, she paused. The silence stretched, making Oliver tense, expecting a scolding or a sarcastic remark. But instead, Eleanor cleared her throat. "Good job," she said, her voice low and rough, as if unused to kindness. The words caught Oliver by surprise, and he looked up, meeting her eyes briefly before she turned and continued walking. It wasn't warm, but it was something. Gradually, more moments like these began to appear. Eleanor started to sit in the living room while Oliver worked on his assignments, not saying much, but simply being there. Sometimes she'd offer a terse nod when he mentioned his grades or achievements. George noticed the shift and dared to smile more around them, sensing a thaw in the household's long winter. Eleanor's cold armor began to crack, not in grand gestures, but in small, almost imperceptible acts. She'd ask, "Do you need anything?" as she passed Oliver's room, or pause while washing dishes when she heard him laughing with friends on the phone. The real turning point came one night when Oliver came home late from studying with friends. He found Eleanor waiting, her face lined with worry. "You're late," she said, her voice carrying both reprimand and an unfamiliar note of concern. He blinked, unsure of how to respond. She sighed, crossing her arms and looking away as if embarrassed by her own emotions. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay," she added, softer this time. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It felt as if they were standing on a fragile bridge, each afraid to take the next step, but knowing it was necessary. Oliver, too, learned that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, but recognizing the brokenness behind it. It came in waves, not with declarations, but with understanding. When he saw his mother staring out of the window one evening, her shoulders hunched and eyes lost in memories, he sat beside her. "I know it wasn't easy for you," he said quietly. Eleanor's eyes glistened, and for once, she didn't hide it. They sat in silence, side by side, as the shadows of their shared history stretched long into the evening. Years later, when Oliver stood at the podium during his college graduation, he scanned the crowd nervously. His gaze found George first, who beamed with uncontainable pride, his hands clapping louder than anyone else's. Next to him sat Eleanor, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore her usual serious expression, but when their eyes met, she gave him a small nod. Her eyes shone with something unfamiliar, pride, tinged with a hint of regret and love that had long gone unspoken. As the ceremony concluded, Oliver walked over to where his parents stood. George embraced him, laughing and patting his back. When Oliver turned to Eleanor, there was a moment's hesitation. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched his arm. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, the words trembling with years of unsaid apologies. Oliver smiled, a warm, forgiving smile that spoke of resilience and healing. He placed his hand over hers and squeezed gently. "I know, Mom," he replied, his voice steady. And in that moment, surrounded by the noise of celebrations and the future calling him forward, the years of hurt began to fade into something softer, replaced by the fragile yet growing bond between a mother and her son. This story reflects the complex generational cycles of pain and the steps toward understanding and healing. It's about learning that even the harshest stories have room for redemption, one fragile moment at a time.